Hi everybody, it's Brian here, and I'm going to teach you how to make knockout text. Knockout text designs using Adobe Photoshop, and the end result is going to be a transparent PNG file. And we're going to start off by creating a new image, and we're going to make it 8 inches by 5 inches, and we're going to change the resolution to 300. It ends up with a big file, but it makes the lines nice and crisp. For those of you that know Photoshop, this background signifies that it's a transparent background, and that's great, but we all know that it's difficult to work on sometimes, so I always like to make an extra layer and give it a nice neutral color, like a nice tannish, brownish, beigeish color, and just fill that in. That's a layer that we're going to turn off before our final product, but for now it serves our purposes. And the first thing we're going to do is make our background text. This is the text that's going to be knocked out. And we're going to make that color black. And we're just going to call that background text. And I'm using the impact font right now. And we're going to play around with it and resize it and shape it and make it look more like text that's supposed to be knocked out. And that looks pretty good right there. And that gives us our background layer. And as you go through this, especially with text, you want to make sure everything looks right and is spelled right and is positioned where you want it to be. Once it is, I like to rasterize that type layer, which turns it from text object into an image object. And that gives us the ability to manipulate the text and delete it without having to worry about the text being affected. Next, we're going to create another text layer. And turn that one off for now. And this is going to be the text that is doing the knocking out. We're going to change the font and the color a little bit just to make it a little prettier. I don't really have a lot of cool fonts laying around, so this one looks pretty good, Kristen ITC. And we're going to change that text color to white. And we're going to have to resize it a little bit. We can play around with that later, that's fine. And that looks pretty cool. So we're going to turn the background back on, and this is where we can play with our text, and this is where we're going to make sure everything is spelled correctly, everything is sized correctly, and everything is where we want it to be and how we want it to look for the finished product. The reason why is because we're going to be rasterizing these text layers, and we want to make sure that we don't have to go back and edit text, because once we rasterize it and start deleting it and adding strokes and doing all that fun stuff, it's not going to be possible to edit the text, and you'll have to either undo a whole bunch or delete the layer and start over. So make sure everything looks pretty good now. Once it does, you're going to rasterize that type as well, and then you're going to duplicate it. And the duplicate layer you're going to call the final output, whatever name you want. So now you have two identical text layers, one on top of the other. The other is going to be the actual cut. This one we're going to use as a mask. So we're going to change that to the layer mask. We're going to give them meaningful names. So once you have these two, what you have to be really careful of is making sure they stay together. If you accidentally nudge one over, you're going to get a really, really bad effect on the end result. And your cut's going to come out wrong, and it's going to look horrible, and you're going to ruin a whole bunch of vinyl. I don't want to see that happen, so it's best to just make sure they stay together. I like to turn that layer off when I'm working with it, but it can be useful as a guide to show you how much space you want to knock out of the background. And in order to do that, we're going to give this text a different color. So I'm going to highlight that text right now. Oh, I already rasterized that, so disregard that last comment. Delete that text layer. And instead, we're going to go to blending options, and we're going to give that text, that final output, a color overlay. And it doesn't matter what color it is, something that you want to stand out. And it doesn't matter at all because you're just using this for visual aid. And you're going to go back in there and turn that blending option off later. So going back to the mask layer, and this is what we're going to use. We're going to stroke that text out and kind of give us an idea of how much text we want to take with us from the background. So we're going to make the stroke layer white. And you can already see there's a fine white outline, but we're going to want to take more than that out of it. So we're going to increase the size of that stroke. And this is where people tend to get carried away. They tend to want to take too much out, and it just looks silly and it makes the background hard to read. So use a little discretion when you're taking up slack on this mask. This seems to be a good amount for me, but it's to each his own, to your own liking. And I like that. So that stroke is going to end up becoming what we're going to end up removing from the background to make our knockout. Now that I've got that mask looking the way that I want, and if it doesn't look the way you want, you can always go back into blending options, and it does give you the option to go back in and resize that stroke and make it bigger or smaller as you see fit. So we're going to do that, and now we're going to re-rasterize that layer style, because now that's going to turn whatever effects you just added, it's going to turn that into an editable image. And now that that's the case, you can hide your final output, and this white shows you exactly what is going to be knocked out of the background. So let's go and select that. We're going to use the magic wand tool to select everything that's white, and then we're just going to turn that mask layer off, select our background, and hit delete. And you just knocked out your first text. Hit Control D to remove that mask layer, and then come back over here, turn on your final output, turn your effects off, turn your background off. Actually, you know what? With white text, that's going to be a little hard to see. Why don't we go back into our final output and let's give that a color overlay of black so everything matches nicey nice. And you now have your finished product. What you can do, if you're going to be using different colors like black text for the background and white text for the knockout, what you could do is just turn one layer off and save that as your black vinyl image. And then you can turn that off and turn your background off, and you save that as your white text. So you have a couple of different options. If you're going to be doing it the same color, you want them both on. But the only other thing, you're pretty much done right now, but the only other thing I want to call your attention to are these little extra leftovers like this and this. And these can be problematic. Cricut's going to have a hard time cutting them. You're going to have a hard time weeding them. And even if you do manage to get them in the final image, it's going to end up looking pretty bad. So what I like to do is come over here to the background layer and use some discretion with the eraser tool, which is right here, and decide what's needed and what isn't needed. So you've got these little tiny pieces that really aren't going to be that relevant. You can kind of go through and delete them. You can decide what looks good and what doesn't. Like for me, under the quick, I would decide that this doesn't really fit into the scheme of things. So use your own artistic style and decide what you think should stay and should go. And once you have your final product and you're happy with it, save it as a complete image and bring it into Cricut or Silhouette. Or if you need to do multicolors, then just save the layers by themselves. Either way, you're done and my tutorial is done. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope I helped you out. Happy Cricketing.